I've lived in Bali, Lisbon, Tulum, Costa Rica, Dubai for a little bit. I always get questions about the logistics or the practicalities of what it's like being a nomad, how to have this lifestyle. I think the biggest thing that comes up is how do you run a business as big as yours, or how do you maintain relationships and foster a sense of belonging when you're constantly moving. I've learned a lot over the last 5 years, and there are definitely things that I wish I knew sooner. Back then, the only way that I knew how to do that was travel blogging. All of that really felt very overwhelming to me. I'm just going to travel the world as a teacher and make my little travel films, and I'll do my photography in between teaching gigs, and that's what I'm gonna do. That was my plan, and I shared that with my family, and everyone kind of laughed at me and thought I was being absolutely ridiculous. You should be accomplishing something, so you need a home. You can't just be gallivanting around the world, traveling for the sake of having experiences. I was on a Bumble date, and he was like, well, I'm a digital nomad. This guy was in his mid to late 30s, and I was like, you're not a young backpacker. So immediately that challenged the perception of the way that I understood travel. It was when I met my ex-partner and I said, where do you live? And he goes, well, I kind of live everywhere, but I'm sort of based between Malaysia, Bali, and then I just fly wherever I want. Welcome back to another episode of the Modern Advice Podcast. I thought it would be really fun today to talk about my relationship with travel and give you a full breakdown and insight into life as a digital nomad, especially since this has become such a pervasive thing throughout our culture in today's day and age. So for those of you who have followed me for a little while, you know that I have been nomadic for almost 5 years now. And I always get questions about the logistics or the practicalities of what it's like being a nomad, how to have this lifestyle. I think the biggest thing that comes up is often, how do you run a business as big as yours while constantly moving? Or how do you maintain relationships, connection, and foster a sense of belonging when you're constantly moving? So I wanted to record this episode for you all today, for anyone who is curious about the digital nomad lifestyle, for anyone who might be considering this, or even for those of you who are perhaps already on your journey of living location independently, but wanting to better optimize your experience and figuring out how you can do this in a more sustainable way. I've learned a lot over the last 5 years, and there are definitely things that I wish I knew sooner, and there are so many things that I can pass on. So let's start today with the story of how this all came about. You know that I love a good story. You know that I love to tell a good story. So how did I start living this way? Well, I started my journey as a nomad in 2012. I was 19, turning 20, in my second year of university, and had been saving for 1 whole year to go backpacking through Europe and Southeast Asia. I spent a total of about 8 months abroad. I don't know how many countries I went to. I was trying to say off the top of my head. Maybe I went to 12, maybe it was 17. It was probably somewhere close to 20, a little bit less than that. And I knew that travel would be a very core part of my way of life, probably for the rest of it. So back then, in 2012, Instagram was just kind of becoming a thing. I was a little bit slow to adopt it. In general, I'm a little bit slow when it comes to technology. I'm never the first person to adopt something. I will always resist as long as possible. Only when something has kind of gained like mass critical adoption will I cave and be like, okay, like I'll get on this. But I'm still very averse to certain things like TikTok, for example. I never got onto the Clubhouse bandwagon. I was like, I really hope that this blows over. And when it did, I was like, yes, I didn't invest any time into this. So, I was not someone who started blogging very early on. Actually, I haven't really ever blogged properly or truly in a consistent fashion. I did, however, have a deep desire to try and make travel a part of my life. And back then, the only way that I kind of knew how to do that seemed to be an option in the culture was travel blogging. So there were a lot of bloggers. That was really common. And I was like, okay, like I don't have, digital skills. I don't know how to build websites. I don't know how to do this SEO thing. I don't know how to, affiliate links. Like, well, how would you even do that? All of that really just felt very overwhelming to me. I was not someone that was a very like do it all yourself kind of person. I was like, oh, I don't have these skills. I don't know how to get these skills. This is all very intimidating. And so even the idea of travel blogging, the technical elements of that kind of felt, too overwhelming for me. And then I thought, okay, well, the other option is that you could obviously be a photographer. And that was something that I really desired. I loved photography for many years. I was very passionate about it. But, that's not a job, right? Like that, again, sort of goes hand in hand with the blogging, unless you sort of somehow hit the jackpot and you were a Lonely Planet National Geographic photographer. And even then I had the feeling like there was more to it than that. And I was like, cool, if, I won the absolute life lottery, that would be great. But otherwise, the thing that everyone sort of did that was pretty reliable was to become an English as a second language teacher. And that was really straightforward. It was like, okay, you do your certification, you learn how to be a teacher, and then you go and, you work in Korea for a year as a teacher, teaching these little Korean kids English. There are so many countries where you can do that. You can do it in Vietnam, you can do it in Thailand, you can do it in China, you can do it in even just a lot of like Latin countries. But there are certain countries that I remember being really high paying for a teacher role, and so there was this website that you could see the average cost of living in different cities, in different countries. You could see how much rent was, how much milk and bread was. And I would kind of calculate the average salary for being this TESOL, English as a second language teacher. And I was like, okay, yeah, cool. Like the biggest way for you to sort of do this and then save money is if you do it in like China or Korea. They were sort of the highest paying. And then if you were sort of tutoring on the side, then you would have a little bit of side money, a bit of private teaching. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to do that. And I'm just going to travel the world as a teacher. And, I'll like make my little travel films and I'll, do my photography in between teaching gigs. And that's what I'm going to do. And so that was my plan. And I shared that with my family and everyone kind of laughed at me and thought I was being absolutely ridiculous. And they're like, you can't do that. That's absolutely absurd. What do you like? How? That's crazy. And that dream just like kind of like a big balloon sort of burst. And I was like, yeah, wow. Okay. I think in my mind at the time, I was like, well, I can give myself 10 years to do this and pursue this before I get to the point where I feel like the societal pressure of you should be accomplishing something, you don't have a house, you need a home, like you need to kind of get it together. Like you can't just be gallivanting around the world, traveling for the sake of having experiences. And so I didn't have the backbone back then to be able to fight for my authenticity and for my values and my desires. I just kind of felt very deflated very quickly and was like, okay, maybe I need a way to travel in between building a career, So it was always this sort of, well, what if I have, this progression up this ladder and then I can travel, in between these like 1.5 or 2 year long sprints where maybe I'm going backpacking for like 6 weeks or 2 months or something like that. And so that was kind of my mindset changed from the teaching English approach to the maybe I'll just live my life in sprints approach. Roll around to 2017. I was on a Bumble date and it was with this guy who I actually don't remember what his name was now, but I always refer to him as like the Brazilian George Clooney because he just kind of looked like George Clooney, but he was Brazilian. So Brazilian George Clooney. And he had like just gotten to Melbourne and I was like, oh, like, what are you doing here? Like, where have you come from? And, like, what's the deal? It was kind of strange to be on a date with someone that didn't live in Melbourne, but was just like, oh, I'm here for a month, maybe 3 months and then, whatever. And I was like, what does that mean? What do you do? Like, how does that work? And he was like, well, I'm a digital nomad. And I was like, what is a digital nomad? Where will you go next? Like, I don't understand. Are you traveling? Like, you're an adult, like this guy was in his mid to late 30s. He was probably in his late 30s, maybe 37, 38. He was silver fox. And I was like, you're not a young backpacker. So immediately that kind of challenged the perception of the way that I understood travel. You know, like I understood it as this rite of passage that you do in your youth, you know, like when you're in your 20s, you stay at hostels and you do it rough and you do weird shit and you do crazy adventurous shit. And so I was like, this guy's like 37, 38, you know, and he is like a professional. And so immediately I'm thinking, this completely breaks down the way that I understand this and the way that I think we've all been taught to understand this, or what's commonly practiced or accepted. And so he goes, yeah, well, you know, I travel as a lifestyle. Like, this is just how I live. You know, like I will spend a month or two in Melbourne and then I'll go back to Budapest and I'll spend 3 months there. You know, maybe I'll go to Buenos Aires. And I was like, what? What do you mean? You just like live in different cities? And he was like, yeah, I just go where I want and I have friends all over the place. And I live, like I actually live there. I'm not visiting, you know, I'm not holidaying. I'm not going to tourist sites. I'm going out to bars and I'm making friends and I'm working while I'm here. And I was like, okay, so what do you do for work then? How do you do that where you can constantly move? Keep in mind, this is 2017. And he goes, oh, I do digital marketing. I have my own agency. And I was like, whoa, okay, that's interesting. That feels attainable. That feels achievable and possible. And I would like to know more about that. So anyway, I think he did, I can't remember. He might have done SEO. He might have done ads. He had a digital marketing agency. It doesn't matter. He was moving and he was, you know, location independent, and it was all very attractive. And it was the first time I'd ever heard the phrase digital nomad, and also just from someone who was so much older. Fast forward 1 year later, I had this mentor in the advertising industry. He was probably one of my earliest mentors. He was a very established brand and content strategist that worked at really prestigious media agencies. And I used to, you know, catch up with him every like few months or so for coffee. I would often go and see him speak in like really big venues around Melbourne. And, you know, he would often give me like advice on how to develop my career in advertising and how to be a strategist, how to build my personal brand on LinkedIn, which I never did. But he was great. And, you know, when I was kind of at this like really pivotal point in my career where I was sort of leaving advertising and I was trying to build my own thing and build my own coaching business, but not really sure. And I was doubting myself. And I sort of went to him for advice and I said, you know, I don't know if I should try and do this or that. You know, what advice can you give me? And he said, you know, I can really see you being a digital nomad. And that was the second time that came up. And I was like, oh, what do you mean? You know, and it's like, that isn't really career advice. That's more lifestyle advice. But at the time, I still didn't really grasp that. But it was the second time that it sort of came into my, you know, field of vision and awareness that someone was directly saying like, this suits you, you know, like, I feel like this would be a great thing for you. I kind of left it again. And it was really only when I met one of my ex-lovers, went to his retreat, then met my ex-partner. If you want the background story, go and listen to episode 1 and 2, our origin story on the podcast for the full scoop. And, you know, stay tuned, opt into my emails so that you can find out when my memoir is released. And it was when I met my ex-partner and I said, where do you live? And he goes, well, I kind of live everywhere, but I'm sort of based between Malaysia, Bali, and then I just fly wherever I want. You know, I'll go to France to get tattoos. I'll go to raves. You know, I'll fly into Burning Man. And I was like, wow, like what do you mean? And so he was like, well, yeah, I'm kind of a digital nomad. And that was the third time that I heard that. And I was like, okay, this is a thing. You know, typically when I see something 3 times, my brain consciously will be like, that's a sign, you know, like 1 time is like, okay, 2 times is a coincidence. 3 times is like my unconscious mind is speaking to my conscious mind and I'm consciously interpreting the signs and the symbols of my environment. And I'm going, yes. Often, you know, like I'll talk to people and they'll say like, how do I know? Da, 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 da. Like, I don't know if I should make this decision. And it's like, well, you know, you can just ask for a sign. You can ask the universe for a sign. Ultimately, when you're seeing that sign, it's really just you planting that for you to consciously be more aware of, right? It's like really you integrating your own unconscious and conscious mind. and your awareness. So I was like, all right, this is clearly something that I want to do. This is clearly something that exists as a pathway. And I'm receiving a lot of confirmation over, albeit over a very long span of time. But from 2017 to 2019, I had 3 signs. And so when I got the 3rd sign, I really committed and said, yes, I'm going to be able to do this. I am going to commit to this. How do I do it? What does that look like? And then I started looking at, there was a website called nomadlist.org. And that website tells you the most popular destinations or hotspots where people are living this lifestyle. And they're sort of, banding together in these little expat communities, these little bubbles where they build infrastructure to support that kind of thing. So they'll build co-working spaces, there's just lots of events happening where people are getting together and building community where you feel like you're a part of something. You can blend in, you can meet friends, you can even date, all these types of things that would make this type of thing feel intimidating. Just it lessens that and it helps that integration process for you to actually just go and move somewhere, anywhere, and be like, cool, now I live in Thailand, or like, hey, now I live in Hungary. So I spent a lot of time on the nomadlist.org website. And at this point, I did have a business. I was already coaching, but I just wasn't making consistent money, and I wasn't making a lot of money. I certainly didn't have enough to create any kind of financial stability where I felt like I could move easily. So I was like, all right, well, technically I don't have a boss. Technically I don't have something that constrains me to a particular place, but I also don't have the resources to, support the freedom and the ease of movement. So it was kind of like, 1 point either side of the argument or the equation. But when I realized that I needed to get out of Australia to change my environment to support what I wanted to accomplish, I was very determined in making that move to Bali, which I did with $700 and a $10,000 limit credit card. So once I was in Bali, I was just like, I'm going to stabilize here, focus on trying to get this business up off the ground. It was really like, I'm moving to Bali and then I'm seeing what happens. Once I got there and once I had really established a base and I figured out like, okay, this is how to do this. And for me, what that looked like was joining a co-working space, joining a gym, going to a lot of events, going to meetups and going to the events that the other nomads were going to, and then kind of forming a community, forming a friendship group, dating, all of these things where I felt like, oh, I've really integrated into the community here. I understand how this works now. It was kind of like I had my system for how to assimilate. And once I had done it successfully once, I felt like I knew how I could replicate that in another environment and then another environment and then another environment. So then I started looking at different places that I could go and I started getting really excited about where else could I do this? And oh my God, this is so exciting. And so after I'd been in Bali for about 4 months, I had the itch to go somewhere else. And I started looking at places nearby. And I thought, okay, cool. I've read about this place in Sri Lanka called Hirikatia. Hirikatia was like the new surf spot, and it was supposed to be the new Canggu, which is like kind of one of the main hotspots in Bali where people nomad and expat. And I was like, oh, cool. Like Sri Lanka is going to be like Bali 20 years ago. This is great. So I packed up my things. I went to Sri Lanka thinking that maybe I was going to be there for a month. I just got a one-way ticket there. This was right before the pandemic hit. And when I got there, I was like, oh, there is no infrastructure here. This is absolutely not built to support the hotspots. Like this is not, there's very little community here. This was so February of 2020 when I was in Sri Lanka. And I thought, okay, this is great. I don't think that I could live here for an extended period of time. Like there's just not enough here. And it was very clear to me that the people that were there were primarily just backpacking or visiting. They weren't there for like, 6 months or 12 months. Like they weren't really living there. Obviously some people do, but that wasn't the majority of people. So I then bought a flight to Lisbon and I thought, okay, cool. This is a really big hotspot. And I got there, but literally about 1 week later, the world went into a global lockdown and I was like, okay. My dreams of setting up in Lisbon and having like this next iteration of my Bali chapter kind of died very quickly and I went into like this isolation. But back then, Lisbon was definitely a hotspot. I think it's even more of a hotspot now. And so it was just like picking and choosing these hotspots and like testing places that were regularly like in that top 10 on Nomad list. So once I'd started, I was like, okay, cool. I know how to do this. I know how to replicate this. And then I think it probably took about maybe 12 months for it to feel really normal, where I was like, this is just my life now. I think at 2 years, I was like, yep, this is just the way that I live. Like I kind of came out of that way of looking at it or seeing it as a temporary thing, or like, oh, this is just my one gap year, and it just didn't feel like a holiday. It didn't feel like a gap year. It just kind of felt like this is always how I'm going to do things. But I think because of where the pandemic was situated, I never had like the true nomad experience that a lot of people have. Like I have a few friends that are really deep in that nomad-based Wi-Fi tribe, nomad cruise community, and they will have traditionally done like 3 months here, 3 months here, 3 months here, or like a month here, a month there, and they've lived in so many different places. Whereas for me, I've just kind of lived in like a couple of main places. So I've lived in Bali, I've lived in Lisbon, Tulum. When I was in Costa Rica, I was moving around quite a bit, so I never felt like I really penetrated a community, although I was in Nusara for a little bit, Dubai for a little bit, but I never felt like I lived the proper nomad life, and I don't feel like I've truly penetrated a lot of those communities. Then it kind of became this thing of like, oh, I think I just need to live in a way where I have multiple bases around the world. And so I definitely do have a need for routine. I definitely do have a need for more structure. And I do get to the point where I'm traveling where I feel overwhelmed and I'm like, I need to just go somewhere that's familiar. And so the idea of constantly going to new places, even though I want and desire the novelty, I'm like, oh no, like I don't have the capacity for this. I don't have the energetic, emotional, mental bandwidth because, my business requires so much of me, or like my body is just feeling really tired. And so I need to go into autopilot mode, because when you're constantly going somewhere new, it requires a lot of energy for you to navigate that new terrain. And ultimately, when you're overwhelmed, you want to conserve as many of your resources as possible, your physical resources. And when you're going somewhere that is familiar, like somewhere you've lived before, it feels really relaxing for the nervous system. It gives you an opportunity to make progress in other areas, and if your physical body is overwhelmed, it gives your nervous system a chance to down regulate. So often, I would have these adventures and then I would just find myself going back to Bali because it was so familiar. And because I had established so much community there, something that I would often run into as a challenge would be that I would often go to a new place and maybe I'd find it challenging to penetrate that community, or after a while I'd get kind of lonely and then I'd be like, oh, I just really miss that deeper friendship, and I would just go back to where I know I have deeper community. And so then I ended up kind of finding that even though I was traveling a lot, I was just always going back to Bali. And so it was this thing of like, I basically just live in Bali and then I just travel. And like, that's my base. Or like, at this point I have more places that I'm sort of frequent, and then they'll be like, I'll use those places as landing pads. But I think that, when you are living in this way, you sort of find your own groove where you do spend, like me, you could spend more time in certain places and they can kind of be your bases or your landing pads. And then you can have like bouts of travel, or you can do it the more traditional way, like some of my friends have done it, where you are consistently doing 3 months here, 3 months there, a month here, and you're kind of just doing that in a more ongoing way. I think that the best way to do this, to make it sustainable, is to have bases. I think if you have a base in it, like each continent, so like let's say you have a base in Europe, you have a base somewhere in like North, Central, or South America, a base in Asia, then you use that as your place where you're familiar, you have your community, the streets, you have your gym, you have your routine, you have the things that ground you, that make you feel safe and comfortable. And then from there, it's like you can always go back there. And so when you start to feel overwhelmed or you feel lonely, you're like, oh, I'll just go home. And then that base becomes your home. And then, you sort of recharge the batteries. And then when you have the itch again, you can kind of go off and go on adventures and travel. But you always have somewhere to sort of go back to that is nearby. And so I think that that's a really good sustainable way of doing it, where you don't feel that home is so far away. Like, you know, if you're from Chicago and you're in Vietnam, you're going to feel like, oh my God, it's so far away. It's like 35 hours. What am I going to, it's going to be 2 days to get home, right? But if you have a base in Chiang Mai and you're in Vietnam, you're like, oh, I'll just go to my base in Chiang Mai and I'll just land there, you know? So I love the idea of having multiple bases. I feel like going somewhere and living there for like 3 to 6 months and really being a part of things helps you feel very easeful. And it's that regularity, right? It's like when you go into the same co-working space every day, it's when you go into the same gym, you go to the same kind of like recovery center and you see the same people, you have that consistency that just feels familiar, and that familiarity makes you feel comfortable, makes you feel safe. And so if you have that in a couple of different places, you're going to feel really at ease just in the world in general. So that's something that I do that I can recommend if you are curious about trying this long term and looking for sustainable strategies. One of the biggest things that I didn't anticipate with this lifestyle that really surprised me was the concept of travel burnout. I had never heard of that as a thing, but it's so real. And when you are constantly moving, you do become very exhausted and you do start to physically degrade. So when you're traveling, you know, I think everyone has a different set point for how long they can kind of go before constant movement starts to become very tiring. And like, I think the joy and the dopamine of like novelty becomes overridden by the constant tension of I'm packing and now I'm unpacking again, and now I need to like figure out where this is and where that is. And so if you've ever done like the backpacking thing, I think for me that tension will drop in at about maybe 6 weeks, maybe 2 months. I definitely notice it. I find that like 1 month, 5 weeks is like very fun without me feeling that tension point. So generally at that like 2 month mark, I might feel that tension point. With the lifestyle of digital nomading where you are working at the same time, you do go slower, right? Because you're not moving and doing stuff every single day. Like you might be working 5 days a week and then like exploring 2 days a week, you know? So again, you find your rhythm with work where you're balancing what you're doing to sustain your lifestyle with the joy or the fun, the hobbies, you know, like the experiences of like, oh, I'm learning salsa dancing, I'm learning tangos, cool, I'm learning saxophone. And I'm going to this lake, I'm going to this church, I'm going to this park. So, you know, for you, it might be that you're working 3 days a week and you're like doing activities the rest, right? And it also just depends on like how taxing your work is and what you do for work and how relatively automatic that is for you. Like if you're doing something that's new and you're like very new into your business journey, it's probably going to be a lot harder for you because you're still getting that footing with your business, right? Or, you know, if you're in a new job, it's going to take a lot of mental bandwidth for you to learn that job. Whereas if you've been doing something for quite a while, it just doesn't take as much brain capacity. And so then you have more capacity to do other things and learn new things and go to new places. Because you are in a different rhythm when you're working, you will be in a place longer before you get tired, right? So the general rule of thumb is like you don't want to be moving more than once a month. I would say like at the absolute max, 2 weeks. If you are moving more frequently than that, you are going to really exhaust yourself and you're probably not going to be able to really enjoy where you are that much. But it also depends what your intention is with going there. Like if my intention is to just go to an event, I might literally just go to the event and maybe have like a couple days either side of arriving or leaving where I'm kind of exploring that place. But I might even just roll into the event and leave versus going somewhere to just be and explore and integrate. And maybe that's a month, you know, maybe it's 2 weeks. It also depends on how much work I have because for me, like my work is very seasonal, you know, it's not consistent every day. So like I might have a month where I'm just not working much at all. I might have a month where I'm working quite a lot. If I'm in a season where I'm working quite a lot, I will probably stay somewhere for like 3 months so that I don't feel so rushed. Whereas if I'm in a season where I'm not working so much, then I might move around more frequently and move every like 2 or 3 weeks or something like that. If I have like a full holiday from work, then I'll just consider it a holiday and I'll travel. So I think it's also really helpful to be mindful of like, am I working? What is like the requirements or the demands of work and how much capacity do I actually have to explore or integrate into this community, or to like do fun things like, you know, learn how to free dive or, you know, go hiking. So just be very mindful of like that work-life balance or the work-travel balance. Things that I have learned really burn you out when you travel is the packing and the unpacking of all your shit. So it's not as much the activities as it is like literally taking all of your belongings and spreading them into an apartment or a house or a room and then packing them all up again. Like that is actually the thing that exhausts you. So something that it took me probably a year to figure this out. And then once I did, I was like, that can be optimized. In my first year of digital nomading, I didn't have a good grasp on booking accommodations. And so I was booking things very last minute. And what that meant is that I was in one city, but I was constantly moving from one Airbnb to the next because things were booked out. You know, it was high season. And so I didn't have these long, like 3-month rental agreements. And even just in Bali as well, like sometimes it can be hard to find long-term leases. And so you're constantly like moving from one place to another. And the inability to actually have like one consistent stable home is the thing that exhausts you. It's not moving from city to city, it's moving from home to home. So if you want to travel in a sustainable way, what I would suggest is make sure that you eliminate any unnecessary packing and unpacking and moving to different accommodations. Like often I will see people going, oh, well, you know, I have this hotel for a couple days and then I go to another hotel, or I have this Airbnb and it's split. Don't do that. Like that is the fastest way to exhaust yourself. Like people really overlook that, but I'm telling you, always, always, always opt for one accommodation per place. Like I will actually fight to like make sure that my flights and accommodations line up so that I'm not like going somewhere, because if you move accommodations, you may as well just go to another city or take another flight or another bus because it's the same amount of effort. So that's like my number one major tip. The second one is time zones, right? Like I see a lot of people who travel a lot, they will go from one continent to another and they will change time zones really frequently. Or they'll, you know, do these like short trips where there's like a really big time difference and they'll just go back after a few days or a week. It takes you 1 day for every hour of time difference to adjust. So if you have an 8-hour time difference and you go somewhere for 7 days, you literally won't even be fully adjusted and you're already on your way back. So you are making it really hard for your body to adapt. So for me, like the way that I like to do things is I will try to not do too many different continents in a year. And so over the last 2 years in particular, you know, it seems like I always travel, but like when I compare my approach to a lot of other people's approaches who probably travel the same amount, but they're more exhausted than me, I'm like, yeah, but I literally spent, you know, 3 months on this continent and then I spent 4 months on that continent. And so I've only really changed time zones maybe 3 times or 4 times in the year. So I haven't changed and then changed back and then like done a lot of short stuff that's created a lot of duress for my body. So like once I'm in Europe or in that general area, I'm going to stay there for a good 3, 4, or 5 months, depending on, you know, if I can duck in and out of the Schengen. Or if I'm in the US, like I'm not leaving the US. I'm going to be there for like a good 2.5 months within the confines of the ESTA, right? I'm not going places for short periods of time. So even if you're going to like other countries, really think about time zones and think about how you can stay on a time zone so that your body can adjust. The next tip would be for you to ground into the natural sunlight so that your circadian rhythms can adjust with that rhythm of nature as quickly as possible. You want to reduce, you know, any kind of artificial light as much as possible. So obviously if you're flying, you know, like you're exposed to a lot of artificial light, you don't really know what time it is. I have personally found that bringing blue light blockers on the plane and wearing them on the plane dramatically helps with the like kind of eyesight fatigue that you feel when you're on a plane and you're like watching a lot of movies, or when you get off the plane and you don't really feel that like rested. So definitely blue light blockers on a plane, massive difference. don't drink alcohol on a plane. A lot of people love to drink alcohol on planes. I think it like makes no sense because drinking alcohol dehydrates you. And when you're flying, it's a massive dehydrating process and it's also very inflammatory. So you want to be more hydrated, not less hydrated. Like, why would you make it harder for your body to adapt? You know, you want to like have lots of really good water on planes and reduce your portion sizes and not be eating and snacking all the time because your body's not going to be able to digest. So it's like you want to just make things as easy for your body as possible, not harder. Like fasting on planes is really great. Trying to eat on the time zone that you're at. And so having the breakfast meal when, you know, you would have breakfast in the new time zone really helps your body to adapt. But definitely I would say like getting outdoors as much as possible and matching your circadian rhythms to the light of the environment that you are traveling to also helps you ground a lot faster as well. Those are definitely like my number one tips, or those are my top tips on how to do this in a way that's just more sustainable. You know, be really mindful of your work, be really clear on like, is this a holiday versus am I working? What's the ratio? When am I going to do things? Communicating that to your team or communicating that to your boss. And yeah, making sure that you're packing and unpacking as little as possible because that's the number one thing.